Welcome to the peak of geek where we've hit the top but with no plans to stop. You know, there are only a handful of video game franchises out there that have truly stood the test of time to deliver successful sequels to a willing and hungry fanbase. And when playing some of them, it oddly gives me a cozy feeling, since I've literally grown up alongside some of these long-running franchises.
For whatever reason, the games I'm usually thinking about here are RPGs like Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, and especially Yakuza, aka Like a Dragon, aka the beat-em-up RPG mixed with epic Japanese dramatic storylines that honestly get me hyped like no other series out there.
And when I think back to when I first decided to give this series a try, when a demo for Yakuza 3 popped up on the PS3 store, I almost forget I originally blew it off. I just didn't get it. But fortunately, a friend of mine said a few magic words that made me reconsider it. Yakuza is a less clunky Shenmue with more RPG elements and less forklifts. And you know what? He was right. So let's talk about how Shenmue's Ryo Hazuki literally paved the way for Like a Dragon's Kazuma Kiryu.
Before we get to how Like a Dragon owes a lot to Shenmue, let's start with how both series owe even more to Virtua Fighter. Virtua Fighter was created by Sega AM2 and Japanese video game designer Yu Suzuki, who also gave us the arcade classics Hang-On, Space Harrier, and Outrun, among many others. Interestingly, Virtua Fighter is also a bit of a legacy title, since it was the first arcade fighting game to feature fully 3D polygon graphics, even though the actual gameplay was still restricted to a 2D plane.
It seems like the advances in video game technology inspired a desire in Suzuki to create more long-lasting and impactful experiences for players. So, Suzuki began researching role-playing games.
While Sega was busy developing the console successor to the Sega Genesis with the upcoming Sega Saturn, Suzuki was busy testing camera, combat, and conversation gameplay systems and became determined to create a fully 3D RPG adventure set in the world of Virtua Fighter starring playable character Akira.
At some point during these early stages of development, buzz began to circle around this ambitious upcoming project, with some choice people at Sega claiming it was going to rock the gaming world. In other words, the hype for Shenmue was unprecedented.
In fact, Suzuki's ambitions grew so outside the confines of the Sega Saturn's tech that development was shifted to Sega's new upcoming console, the Dreamcast, and the project was given its official title, Shenmue.
After a few more years of development, the game was eventually released as a Dreamcast exclusive on December 29, 1999. While North American players would have to wait until November 7th of the next year to get their hands on it. At the time of its release, the game's purposeful slower pace and clunky controls put some players off. But many concluded that Yu Suzuki and team had created something truly revolutionary.
Shenmue stars Ryo Hazuki, a teenage martial artist living in Japan circa 1986. One day, he returns home to witness his father's murder at the hands of a strange man named Lon D over something called a dragon mirror. So begins a classic tale of revenge. And considering this game originally released in 1999, the level of detail is staggering. There's a real-time day and night cycle that you must monitor at all times, since stores are only open at certain times, buses run on a set schedule, and if you stay out too late, you'll automatically fast travel back home before midnight. This is the first great example of a somewhat open world game, something gamers of today are very familiar with.
There's no denying that playing Shenmue today is a bit cumbersome. I tend to control Ryo a little bit like a car, where I turn him with the D-pad and hold the trigger to make him run. But it can be a little frustrating trying to turn around and line up those specific interaction points. Still, there's an undeniable charm to it all. This small 1980s Japanese town is a pure joy to explore, even today.
Other than asking everyone you see for directions, there's also combat sequences lifted directly from Virtua Fighter, along with a brand new gameplay element never seen before, but often imitated to this day: QuickTime events. These are interactive cutscenes where you must press a specific button at a specific time to proceed. And while exploring the town, you can also play Hang-On or Space Harrier at the local arcade, along with various other mini-games to pass the time.
As the story progresses, you'll also need to get a job driving and sometimes racing forklifts, which becomes quite addictive in its own right. But before you know it, Ryo ends up angering the local gang, who kidnap his friend Nozomi. Fortunately, he saves her and brokers a deal with the gang to meet with the man who killed his father. Traps are set and people are double-crossed, and Ryo soon learns he must travel to China to seek the help of a new martial artist to continue his journey. And thus, the game ends on a cliffhanger.
The story would continue with Shenmue II in 2001, a sequel that improved on the original in almost every way. More story, more fighting, more places to explore, and way more characters to meet along the way. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Shenmue 2 didn't sell nearly as well as the first one, and plans for a third were unfortunately shelved for almost 20 years.
Yu Suzuki always wanted more games, but he would have to wait until a crowdfunding effort in 2015 would secure the necessary funds and become the most funded game in Kickstarter's history. Shenmue III would eventually release in 2019 as a game that willfully ignored everything that had happened in video games since its hibernation. This was a game made strictly for fans of the first two games, and nobody else.
The graphics may have significantly improved, but the gameplay stayed the same. Yu Suzuki stuck to his original vision of a long-running story, and even some hardcore fans were a bit upset over how little the plot seemed to move forwards in this latest installment. And considering how poorly this game was received and sold, it seems unlikely that we'll ever see a conclusion to Ryo's story of revenge, even though Suzuki himself is still hopeful about it.
Now, it's time to travel back to the beginning to shine a light on the other important person in this story.
In 1989, a young Toshihiro Nagoshi joined Sega AM2 to work under Yu Suzuki as a CG designer. He would go on to design several arcade games before stepping into the director's chair for the racing classic Daytona USA, released in 1994. And 4 years later, he would direct Spike Out, a 3D beat-em-up game that may look a bit familiar to Streets of Rage fans.
During development of Shenmue, Nagoshi originally joined the team as supervisor. Nagoshi would later call this moment a major turning point in his career. He'd become frustrated with how big the project had grown and asked Sega for his own development division. The CEO agreed, but asked Nagoshi for support to finish Shenmue, so he assumed a new role as producer and director. Apparently, Nagoshi was the only one Suzuki would listen to, and together, they brought this ambitious game to the finish line.
With his new development division, a company he called Amusement Vision, Nagoshi would go on to create the Super Monkey Ball series and produce F-Zero GX before releasing a new Spike-Out game called Battle Street, with combat that may look a bit familiar, featuring a power-up meter for unleashing some spicy attacks. Then in 2005, Nagoshi hinted at something new he was working on, at the time dubbed Project J. He described it as a powerful, gritty drama where you feel the sense of humanity. Project J would eventually be revealed as Ryo ga Gotoku, literally translated to Like a Dragon, or its eventual localized title, Yakuza.
Okay, yes, I know, they've since changed the Western title to Like a Dragon, but we'll refer to the first game as Yakuza for now, since that was the original title. Anyway, during development, Nagoshi was worried about two things: the rising popularity of Western video game developers, and the lack of older gamers he witnessed in Japan. Yakuza was designed to cater to both. To create a game that was inherently Japanese and steeped in its unique culture, while simultaneously drawing in adult gamers with its more mature storyline and playable character to go with it.
At its heart, Yakuza is a very adult beat-em-up action game with open-world RPG elements that feel like you're playing an epic Japanese drama. The game follows Kazuma Kiryu, the lovable Yakuza who can never catch a break. When his best friend murders their Yakuza boss, Kiryu takes the blame and the prison sentence. But when he's released, he finds out 10 billion yen have been stolen from his Yakuza clan. Then the same best friend who sent him to prison murders his adopted father, and the woman he loves goes missing. Soon, he meets a helpful detective and an orphan girl, proving Kiryu can make alliances everywhere he goes. We're also introduced to my favorite character, Goro Majima, Kiryu's sometimes ally, sometimes adversary, who frequently reminds me of a certain lovable Saiyan prince.
There's so many more twists and turns in this game that'll probably make your head spin, and honestly, it gets even more complicated and ridiculous with each subsequent entry of this wild and unpredictable video game series. Okay, real talk though, I actually slept on the first two Yakuza games when they originally released. I wasn't as into gaming back then, and I only revisited the PS2 titles once I gave the third one a chance and fell in love with its over-the-top style and addictive gameplay. One of the reasons I remember not enjoying the game at first was due to critics at the time comparing Yakuza to the Grand Theft Auto series, which couldn't be further from the truth. In their defense, Yakuza is hard to define or explain, unless you remember a certain Dreamcast game from a few years ago.
Gameplay-wise, the friend I mentioned at the beginning hit the nail on the head. If you've played Shenmue, this game will feel very familiar. You explore a Japanese setting in a semi-open world environment trying to solve a mystery. You can find tons of mini-games like wrestling with a UFO catcher or smashing a few home runs at the batting cage, but the playable Sega arcade classics that can be found in Shenmue wouldn't show up in Yakuza for a few more titles. But you do get into fights that mimic a beat-em-up style gameplay, and there are quick-time events to test your reflexes, and in this case, pull off devastating special attacks. And the story tells an epic drama reminiscent of classic revenge tales.
It's clear that Nagoshi was inspired by the core ideas Suzuki originally put into Shenmue, but everything seems a bit more refined here. And where I think Yakuza succeeds and ultimately surpasses Shenmue, at least for me personally, is that its main gameplay loop is the beat-em-up style combat and not the exploration. In Shenmue II, this is slightly less of a problem, but in the first game, the combat is sporadic and mostly saved for the second half of the game. Yakuza, on the other hand, puts the combat front and center, and makes it satisfyingly brutal and almost cartoonishly violent.
Just so you know, the original two Yakuza games were released on PS2 with a dub only, and I can't really take it seriously.
We gotta make up for this. Ow! I should kill you. Stupid!
To be fair, Mark Hamill kills it as Goro Majima, but I feel the seriousness of the story is lost a bit with those English voices. But don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. Yakuza isn't afraid to show off its sillier side, especially in later entries. While I greatly enjoy the combat and seeing the plot slowly unfold, at the end of the day, it's all about the sub-stories for me. These are optional encounters that center around Kiryu helping random people with their problems. Sometimes these are friends, but usually they are complete strangers with silly, odd, or surprisingly emotionally deep problems, and you never know what to expect.
As the series progressed, it became obvious, at least in those early days, that being a Yakuza fan was a lot like cheering for the underdog. The games have always been massive undertakings for localizers, and I still appreciate every new entry we see translated into English. Fortunately, more and more people seem to be falling in love with this series every day.
A quick heads up, while I do mostly recommend the original PS2 release of Yakuza for those curious about the series' origins, most players would be better off playing Yakuza Kiwami, its much improved remake which can be found on most modern consoles and PC. But if beat-em-up style combat isn't your jam, fortunately, Sega isn't afraid to experiment with switching up the gameplay. The latest mainline entry swapped out the beat-em-up gameplay for traditional turn-based RPG combat, and it was incredible. And while I will always stand my man Kiryu, I'll be first in line for all of Ichiban's JRPG adventures too.
While I'm forever thankful to Yakuza 3 for introducing me to Like a Dragon, one of my favorite video game franchises of all time, I'll never forget that Shenmue is what ultimately brought me here. And when I discovered that both games' creators mastered their craft working side by side in the early days at Sega, everything seemed to click into place. I started seeing Shenmue's DNA all over Like a Dragon. But let me be very clear. While I personally prefer Like a Dragon, I do love Shenmue. Shenmue II was the first original Xbox game I ever played, and at the time, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I'm still holding out for an eventual conclusion to Yu Suzuki's epic storyline. We all deserve closure to Ryo Hazuki's adventure. But what do you think? Did you play the Shenmue or the Like a Dragon series? If not, I honestly recommend them both. A fair warning that Shenmue can be a bit stiff to control and a bit slow to get going due to its age, and Like a Dragon can be a bit overwhelming and complicated due to the sheer number of games and spin-offs, but both of these series should be experienced by every gamer out there. If you do give them a try, let me know what you think down in the comments below. And until next time, would you like to try a game of Lucky Hit? How about trying a game of Lucky Hit?
Would you like to try a game of Lucky Hit?
Nah, I'm cool.
How about trying Lucky Hit?
Nah, I'm alright.